All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We got a ton of questions about something pretty big going down in Australia, and honestly, it has implications for all of us, so we had to unpack this.
Absolutely. This is one to watch for sure.
So, late last year, Australia passed this law banning social media for anyone under 16. It's supposed to roll out this December. On the surface, it's all about protecting kids online. You know, the classic, think of the children.
Yeah, the for their own good kind of argument.
But digging a bit deeper, there are a lot of questions swirling around this whole thing, whether it's really about safety or if there's something else going on. We're talking government overreach, enforcement issues, whether social media is really the boogeyman it's made out to be, the potential for actually isolating kids further, and, well, whether this whole thing is just too extreme.
Right. A lot of layers to peel back here.
Exactly. So let's dive in, starting with the official justification from the Australian government.
Well, their main argument boils down to protecting young people's mental health. They're pointing to things like cyberbullying, the pressure to have the perfect body image, all that. Prime Minister Albanese himself has been pretty vocal about these concerns. This led to the Online Safety Amendment Bill, specifically the social media minimum age part, which is designed to pressure these big platforms to comply.
Yeah, and they're not messing around with the penalties either. We're talking fines up to 50 million Australian dollars for companies that don't play ball.
That's a huge chunk of change, definitely gets your attention. But, and this is a big but, the law itself is pretty vague on the how. Like, how do they actually plan to stop under 16s from using these platforms in the first place? They throw around terms like age assurance technology, which sounds fancy, but the details are murky at best.
Right, so it's all very trust us, we got this,
Yeah.
without actually explaining how they're going to pull it off.
And that lack of clarity is exactly what's feeding all these concerns about government overreach. Some critics are straight up calling this a Trojan horse, a way for the government to sneak in more control over internet access down the line. And honestly, the way they rushed this bill through Parliament in a single day, without much scrutiny, doesn't exactly inspire confidence.
It all feels a bit too fast-tracked.
Yeah, exactly. Even the Australian Human Rights Commission, they chimed in and warned about potential violations of privacy, citing Article 17 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights.
Okay, so red flags popping up all over. But let's say, for argument's sake, that they managed to implement this thing. Are kids really just going to, like, log off and disappear from social media?
If history's taught us anything, it's that teenagers are pretty resourceful, especially when it comes to online restrictions. We've seen similar bans in other countries, and the data shows that a good chunk of teens just turn to VPNs to bypass those blocks. There was this study in France a couple of years back, and they found that nearly half of teens were already using VPNs to access stuff they weren't supposed to. And guess what? There are already reports of Aussie teens saying they'll do the same.
So they're basically one step ahead of the game.
Pretty much. And get this, VPN providers, they actually see surges in new customers every time a country tries to restrict internet access. It's like clockwork.
Yeah.
Remember when YouTube tried to force everyone to verify their age back in 2021? Proton VPN saw this massive spike in signups, particularly from countries where access was limited. And then you've got folks like 0D1, a developer who created this tool to bypass YouTube's age checks. That thing has been downloaded over 2.5 million times. It's not hard to find people online, especially on X, talking about how they're going to get around this ban.
Sounds like it's going to be pretty tough to enforce. And what about those other methods they've been tossing around, like facial recognition to verify age?
Yeah, about that. Those methods, they have some serious flaws. Take facial recognition, for example. It can be pretty inaccurate, especially when it comes to teenagers. Their faces are still changing and developing, and even the leading companies in this tech, like Yoti, admit their system can be off by as much as 2 years when trying to pinpoint the age of someone between 13 and 16. And that's not even considering the documented biases in facial recognition. Studies have shown that these systems have much higher error rates for people with darker skin tones, sometimes misclassifying them by up to 35%.
Wow. So not only is it potentially inaccurate, it could also be discriminatory.
Exactly. And then there's behavioral analysis, the idea that you can figure out someone's age based on how they type or interact online. Well, that's pretty easy to fake, too. Kids are digital natives. They'll figure it out. Plus, even if they do get caught, there are no real consequences for individuals. The law only targets the platforms, not the users.
So you could argue it's all bark and no bite.
Kind of, yeah. And look, this isn't just speculation. We've seen similar bans fail before. France tried to restrict social media for under 15s, and Utah in the US had this law that got completely overturned because it was just too hard to enforce and ran into all sorts of legal challenges.
Okay, so enforcement seems like a major obstacle. But let's talk about the heart of the argument for this ban. The claim that social media is directly causing this decline in young people's mental health. Is that really true?
It's definitely more complicated than the headlines make it seem. While there's a correlation, meaning mental health issues and social media use seem to be rising together, that doesn't necessarily mean one causes the other. In fact, there was a study published just this year in The Lancet, a pretty reputable medical journal, that looked at over 1,200 teenagers. They found that even with really strict bans on phones in schools, there was no significant difference in the kids' mental health.
So even when you limit access, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem.
Right. It seems like those teenagers were still finding ways to use their phones and social media outside of school hours. And some researchers, like Blake and Scott from the University of Queensland, they argue that while mental illness is indeed rising among young people, the evidence linking it specifically to social media is pretty thin. They say it's more likely a complex mix of factors like economic inequality, climate change anxiety, maybe even shifts in parenting styles.
So it might be too simplistic to just blame it all on social media.
Absolutely. And there's also the fact that social media can actually have positive effects on mental well-being, especially for certain groups. For example, Reach Out, an Australian online mental health service, they found that a whopping 73% of Aussie teens use the internet to access mental health support. And Christopher Stone from Suicide Prevention Australia, he's argued that these platforms can actually help foster connections and build communities, which is especially important for young people who might be feeling isolated or marginalized, like LGBTQ plus youth.
So a blanket ban could actually end up harming some of the most vulnerable kids.
That's the worry. And it ignores the context, right? Not all social media use is the same. Supervised use, engaging with positive content, connecting with supportive communities, those aspects are often left out of the conversation. It often feels like the government narrative relies heavily on these anecdotal horror stories to justify the ban without acknowledging the full picture.
Right, like cherry-picking the worst-case scenarios. Which brings us to another major concern that's been voiced. The potential for this ban to actually sever important social connections for young people.
For a lot of kids, especially those in rural communities or those with really specific interests, social media isn't just a way to kill time, it's how they connect with their peers, build relationships, find their tribe. We've heard from young people like Teresa Hussein, a 14-year-old refugee living in Darwin who uses social media to stay in touch with her grandmother in Malawi. And then there's Will Haynes, a 16-year-old musician who uses platforms like Instagram and TikTok to collaborate with other artists around the world.
So for some, it's really a lifeline to the outside world.
Exactly, and the Human Rights Commission has highlighted this too. They point to Article 17 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which emphasizes the importance of ensuring children's access to diverse information and ideas for their well-being.
So banning them from these platforms could actually be seen as a violation of their rights.
Potentially, yes. And Senator David Shoebridge, he's been quite vocal about this, arguing that this ban will hit the most vulnerable kids the hardest, cutting them off from vital support networks. And there's also the risk that they'll just migrate to less regulated corners of the internet, places where there's less oversight and potentially more danger. The Australian Institute of International Affairs, they've warned that this could push young people towards dark web forums and other risky online spaces.
So instead of protecting them, it could actually make them more vulnerable.
Precisely. And what really rubs salt in the wound is how inflexible this ban is. There are no exceptions, no pathways for parental consent, no tiered access based on age or maturity level. It's this one-size-fits-all approach that completely ignores the nuances of how young people actually use and engage with the internet. It feels very out of touch with the generation that's grown up being digitally savvy.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly. And this brings us to the final point, which is just how extreme this whole thing feels. The word draconian has been thrown around quite a bit, and it's hard to argue with that assessment. I mean, Australia is going for a blanket ban at 16, which is much stricter than other countries that have tried to implement similar measures. France, for instance, sets the age limit at 15, and they allow for parental consent. In the U.S., the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA, sets the bar at 13.
So Australia is really going further than most.
Absolutely. And there's been zero talk of any alternative solutions, no discussion of strengthening parental controls, no consideration of placing a legal duty of care on the platforms themselves to ensure the safety of their young users. It's all about punishment and restriction. The massive fines, the rushed passage of the law, despite experts calling for more time and debate, it all points to a very particular approach that feels quite heavy-handed.
It's interesting to see the disconnect between public opinion, which seems to be largely in favor of the ban, probably driven by parental fears and anxieties, and the reaction from young people themselves. They're calling it dystopian and a dictatorship online.
It highlights the generational divide in how we view and understand the internet. And while the government might be patting themselves on the back for taking a tough stance, the international community is watching with a healthy dose of skepticism. The recent case in Utah, where a similar law was struck down by a federal judge, is a reminder that these kinds of bans often run into serious legal and ethical roadblocks.
So it's not just about keeping kids off their phones. It's about fundamental freedoms and the evolving relationship between technology and society. This Australian social media ban is a Pandora's box of complex issues, and it seems like we're just starting to grasp the potential consequences. As we've explored all this, what are your thoughts on the balance between online safety and the freedoms of young people? This is a conversation that's far from over, and it has implications for all of us.
Absolutely. It's a global conversation, and the choices made in Australia will undoubtedly ripple outward. It's crucial to keep asking these tough questions and to engage in informed and nuanced discussions about how to best navigate the digital landscape. The stakes are incredibly high for young people and for the future of online freedom.
Well said. And to everyone listening, we'd love to hear your thoughts on all this too. This is a conversation that demands diverse perspectives. Let's keep talking, keep questioning, and keep working towards a digital future that is both safe and empowering for everyone.
I couldn't agree more.
All right, that's it for today's deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.